is my sincere pleasure to introduce Timothy Loney here today. This is Timothy's third annual Two Secret presentation, this time not coordinated under the stress of urgency due to some other thing falling through. So I am so honored that you're willing to share your expertise and your passion for learning and your incredible teaching skills with our community. Timothy is the sociology professor at Minnesota North Vermilion Campus, and you may recall that Timothy also was a shining star in the Ely Dancing with the Ely Stars. So round of applause for Timothy.
Lacey didn't have nice things to say the night of things, but glad that she's feeling better about the competitors today. Thank you all for being here. I truly enjoy being able to present to everyone and to talk to the group, and I definitely enjoy talking about something that is a little bit more positive as well. Sociologists do talk about good things, just so everybody knows. Not all about the problems of the world. And so this kind of sparked based on just some conversations with Lacey and conversations at a recent sociology conference of things that are missing in the discipline that often aren't necessarily included in courses. And the idea of when we talk about studying society, I think happiness should be up there in terms of things that we study and talk about. And so this is digging into that. This is an entire field, as you know, you can in different disciplines, in genetics and psychology and sociology, it's an entire field. So to really condense that down to a 5-hour talk today with you, it's going to be difficult, but we'll squeeze it into. So a term that is used in sociology when we talk about happiness is this idea of subjective well-being, because of course we have to talk about kind of social constructs of things. What does it mean to be happy? And so the well-being, when we look at the subjective well-being, everyone's different level of happiness is always different. You might see people that don't necessarily express outward happiness, but they are doing just fine, and others that tend to show it all the time, like Lacey, right? But we are both equally happy, and so it's this kind of subjective well-being is really looking at how do people perceive their own wellness, their own health, their own happiness, their own joy as well. And so a little breakdown of what we're going to cover today is just some terminology. If you Google happiness, you're going to find, I don't know how many definitions. And so today we're just going with one, and we're going to go with some very abstract ideas about what is joy, what is happiness, just to simplify things today. And then for the sociological piece, we're breaking it down on kind of a macro, meso, and micro level of what is happiness and how is it impacted by social forces. Couple pieces, since we're in Ely, I wanted to include the idea of how the environment, the natural world, can impact happiness, because that's an important element that we have here. And then you'll have an opportunity to explore your own joy and happiness. So what are the differences? Well, joy and happiness sometimes can be used interchangeably by people. Other times they have completely separate, unique definitions. And so for joy, the definition we're going to use today just comes from Merriam-Webster, defined as a feeling of great pleasure or happiness that comes from success, good fortune, or a sense of well-being. And so for joy, we're going to use this as it's kind of in research regarded as an inner feeling. And for happiness, we're going to use a definition from Veenhoven, defined as the overall appreciation of one's own life as a whole. And so it's almost this more broad idea of not this kind of psychological sensation of happiness emerging, but the general overall happiness in your life. And it's often regarded as kind of this outward expression from the sociological world. So something that sparks joy, if you've heard of that, would be kind of this inward feeling of when things occur. Happiness, we're going to be looking at kind of the longer spectrum totality of things. So I wanted to cover a couple different disciplines first, and looking at biology. And so there's some really interesting things regarding happiness. Where does it come from? And so if we're looking at the roots of happiness, unfortunately, there's pieces of this that we don't have total control over as much as we would like. And so the genetics and trying to isolate things, so isolate, identify the happy gene, as they call it, and the happy nerve and the happy hormone. But what research is really showing us, if we're using an interdisciplinary approach, is that up to 50% of what we call happiness comes from your genetics. So write a thank you letter to your family. If you're a happy person, they have largely contributed to that. So what does that mean if it's up to half? We don't fully understand it, but we're looking at kind of the environment you're in the genetics, accounting for this idea that we have these hormones, right? The certain nerves and the genes that account for it. I'm not a biologist, so that's about where that biological talk ends today. But do know that roots of your own happiness come from that. Thank you, Mom and Dad. Some interesting things is, how do we find this information? 50%. We have to do research. And so there's one particular study that I found interesting is from Norway. There's a kind of this emergence of twin studies to try to understand the play of genetics and psychology. And it looked at this idea that 30% of the variance, the differences between individuals in happiness, was really down to genetics. And there were specific aspects then of the personality that were inherited from parents that influenced this. So when we say it's 50%, where does that really come from? And it comes from neuroticism, so leaving people more vulnerable to anxiety and depression, extroversion, encouraging activity and more social behavior, and then disposition. So the disposition toward positive emotions. Those were the things that they found that were impacting those levels of happiness. And so they concluded that the happier, satisfied personality thus seems to have low levels of anxiety and depression and high levels of positive emotions and activity, broadly speaking. And so that's from the biological side of things. Psychology, this is where we kind of start to see this differentiating between joy and happiness. Kind of the outer state and joy as this overflowing of inner energies as well. And so happiness, according to May, is the absence of discord. Joy is kind of the welcoming of this as the basis of kind of the higher harmonies. So happiness is finding a system of rules which solve our problems. Joy would be taking the risk that is necessary to break new frontiers. So trying to differentiate, almost dichotomizing the joy and happiness. And then a lot of this emerges from a new field of psychology called positive psychology. And that's what's, it's a scientific study of what makes life most worth living. Kind of differentiating between the origins of psychology of really looking at what's wrong. We love to look at what's wrong. And so positive psychology, emerging kind of in the last 30 years as a newer field in psychology, looks at what makes life worth living. And so there's even positive sociology kind of emerging as a field tied to positive psychology as well. So what's missing when we're talking about happiness? We have our genes, we have the kind of the psychological piece of joy. Well, sociologists want to look at what is the situation. We always want to define the situation. And so sociology of joy looks at happiness in the social context. So what we're looking at is kind of the causes and consequences of certain relational behaviors between and among human beings. So what are these phenomena that happen? Gratitude, kindness, sympathy, empathy, compassion, respect, social connections is a huge piece of talk today. Camaraderie, solidarity, play, gatherings, music, stories, comedy, arts, games, flirting, love, sex, generosity, service to others, and many more. So when we're looking at happiness, we're not looking at just how are you feeling today, how are you feeling about your life. It's more of kind of some of these actions that are coming in, right? What are the social phenomena? How do you feel when you give to others? That's generally when we feel best. And then there's also non-human interactions, and that's kind of where we'll end, get towards the end, right? The idea of interactions with animals, nature, culture, and our built environment. So when we're looking at the sociological piece of joy and happiness, we're looking at how does happiness and joy emerge out of varying social contexts. This would fall in the field of symbolic interactionism, really looking at the idea of how do we make meaning of the world around us? How do we make meaning through interacting with others? So we're going to start at the macro level. Who's the speaker on the dark sky coming tomorrow? Todd, perfect. So Todd might be using an image like this to talk about changes in America and what the sky looks like at night. But the macro level, what we're looking at is larger things, culture, economic policy, things that we don't necessarily physically interact with. And so at the macro level, I'm going to talk about two phenomena, the pursuit of happiness and materialism. So pursuit of happiness, where does this come from? What was that? Bill of Rights, Declaration of Independence, and there's a few other pieces in even in our Constitution talking about this idea of happiness, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So it's embedded in these inalienable rights that were written for us many years ago. And so it's something that we seek to protect at the macro policy level, this idea of a pursuit of happiness. So I want to step back and ask you, when we say we have this phrase, pursuit of happiness, what are we striving for? And I say that kind of from a cultural sense. What is this pursuit of happiness? Everyone has their own individual, but what are some shared ideas of this pursuit of happiness in maybe the United States or Minnesota or your own culture growing up? Wealth. Okay, yeah, wealth could definitely be a piece of that. Money does buy happiness to a certain extent, so. Safety. Safety is another one, absolutely, in terms of that would protect happiness.
Freedom, sense of a level playing field.
Oh.
Fairness.
Fairness, yes, okay, so a level playing field, we'll do the hand raising, so now we're getting more ideas. Yeah.
Freedom.
Freedom, absolutely, right? So the idea of pursuing that, and then Mac. Community, yes. So all of these things lead into this idea of the pursuit of happiness. And so do we have policies in place to protect these things that y'all just shared? Yeah, some extent, right? So we talk about the level playing field, right? We could talk about different policies, maybe the idea of public education, that could be something that would level the playing fields, that everyone have the ability to get an education. Those pieces there. How many people own a home? Perfect. Okay, so that becomes part of this idea of the pursuit of happiness. There's a lot of levels of happiness associated with home ownership as well. And these different things that we pursue. So we have policies in place then to try to protect some of these things. The idea of community, having different levels of government so that a community can actually have some control over how the community is run. All of those things kind of fall into this idea of the pursuit of happiness. So it leads to this kind of idea of the American dream that we all tend to culturally embrace. And one issue when we look at the macro level, if we look at things that are affecting happiness, what happens if we have this shared goal that becomes harder to attain over time? The idea that the balloon is getting farther away. we can look at this in a variety of theories, and I wanted to point to strain theory. This is a theory that we talk about in crime and delinquency. When we look at where's crime rising, why are crime rates changing? And strain theory looks at this idea of the American dream and says that society puts pressure on individuals to achieve this. Now, some people might see that as in a negative sense, but not necessarily, right? The pressure to actually succeed is a good thing that can be a driving force, right? How many people had parents that encouraged them to go to college? All right, so that pressure can actually be a really positive thing. And having those social pressures, which often get a negative connotation, actually push us to do things that maybe we wouldn't otherwise strive for. And having shared goals is another way for society to see, are we able to achieve these norms? Are we able to hold on to those norms? What strain theory looks at is, though, what happens when people lack the means to achieve these shared societal goals. Thus, it's called strain theory. Nice thing about sociology, we have really simple names. Causes strain to society. And so it looks at the idea of when this gets farther away. You might read headlines and articles about Gen Xers and millennials trying to buy a home and struggling, and inflation's up, wages are stagnated, and home prices are skyrocketing. Well, that makes this ability to achieve the American dream much harder than it was for previous generations. So we have kind of a generational gap on shared understanding of these dreams. And so at the macro level, we see two things that we're experiencing right now that could affect people's happiness. And so this is outside of kind of your relationship with family and friends, but the idea of economically speaking or culturally, socially speaking, are we able to achieve those things that we share? Another piece is that when we see massive social change really quick, and it leads to this kind of what's called normlessness, or what Durkheim called anomie. And anomie is a social condition defined by an uprooting or breakdown of any moral values, standards, or guidance for individuals to follow. So is there a recent global event that might have changed the norms of how everyone lives their lives? I can't think of one either. So hopefully coming out of the COVID pandemic, when we look at it in just a macro level, what we see is that many things changed. We saw a massive amount of wealth change, unfortunately, increased massive inequality in the United States. And so why are we talking about this when we're trying to talk about happiness? Well, from a macro level, or like this general idea of happiness, of how you feel about your life, if you're not achieving those steps, or the steps to do the things that are seen as this American dream are taking longer, it leads to a decrease in happiness and an increase in stress and strain on individuals that feel like they're no longer able to achieve what was previously achievable. And so we won't dive too far into crime, but it leads to people considering other alternatives then to potentially achieve the American dream or otherwise. Another piece, when we're talking about happiness and why we have to look at kind of the macro level, is we have to look at the idea of what are some of these cultural shared norms or even media influenced norms that we have in society. And so we live in a very unique spot where, this is not as prevalent as other areas, but the idea of materialism or a materialistic culture. And what materialism is really looking at is the idea of a tendency to consider material possessions and physical comfort as more important than spiritual values. And spiritual values is pretty broad, right? Could be religious, could be spiritual. But the idea that we seek out these material possessions. And when we live in more of a materialistic culture, we have more material goals than spiritual goals in society. And that really changes then people's level of happiness, because if you're not achieving the material goals, also material goals tend to be very kind of quick on their adrenaline rush or joy and not as long lasting as spiritual or communal relationships. So it really changes how that society is impacted. And so it leads to this concept called symbolic self-completion. And it leads people to seek out social symbols of achievement regarding a goal meaningful to one's own self-identity. And so when we have kind of this social symbols of material goods, or we're shopping for new material products, that's where our happiness is derived from, or our joy even, that inner joy is derived from. How many people have a cell phone in here? How long until you are no longer happy with your new phone? As soon as it's out of the box. Yeah, once you pay for it. And so what happens in this, when we live in a goal-oriented society, which again can be a really positive thing, when we commit to a goal, it creates this psychological tension or strain until the goal is achieved. And when we have a materialistic kind of view, or we have individuals that really thrive in or live in this materialism, you constantly have these new goals because whatever that thing is that Apple just made, they're going to make a new one, and now you're trying to keep up with that. Whereas relationships are much more fluid, and you can maintain them in very different means without material currency. So what happens at the meso and micro level? We're going to look at social networks, family, and relationships. So social network theory is a theory I really enjoy in sociology. It's an emerging theory. We're getting more understanding of the idea of the people in our networks and how they shape our behavior and our attitude. And and I'll explain that image here in a second. But social network theory, it focuses on the role of social relationships in transmitting information, channeling personal or media influence, and enabling attitudinal or behavioral change. So the idea that depending on the people that we associate with, work with, have a family with, friends with, it's going to influence our behavior and attitude. And only recently, really in the last 20 years, we're getting a better understanding of how much does that influence us. And so the image on the right is a really interesting study that was done in the mid-2000s from Dr. Nicholas Christakis, but he was looking at the rise of obesity in the United States. Now, we know a lot of the roots of the rise of obesity, more sedentary lifestyle, people are moving less, we're eating food that is not as healthy. Those are pieces to it. But he was wondering from the social side, how does that change? Because the norms also shift in terms of what we feel as is acceptable. So at the same time, we have kind of people pushing the idea of obesity as a health problem. We also have kind of a body positivity movement emerging too, to recognize and accept different body types. What was really interesting about this study is he studied a large network for 32 years. And I couldn't figure out how to put the video in there, and technology's not my thing. But what happened is over 32 years, the people changed. The yellow bubbles are obese people, and it kept shifting and changing and moving. And what he found was that the yellow bubbles started clustering together. And so they became very curious of why did people kind of all of a sudden associate or move towards people with different body types. And this network analysis now is going to be used to study other things. And so I proposed it in here because I believe there's a study that started on the idea of happiness. Do we change our direction in a social network? Do we associate with different people based on maybe the happiness that they exude? And so in this study, he saw that different things change. People change their norms, they change their behaviors. And so if your friends go out for beer and muffins all the time, and you do that, that will definitely change, right? If your friends start working out and you pick up on those habits, then all of a sudden, everything changes there as well. The last piece, when we one piece on it was a meta-analysis of the longevity of happiness. And it points to this really important piece. Your close relationships, your friendships, and your social network are one of, if not the highest predictor of your sustained happiness. How many people have long-term friends in their life for many, many years? That has been found through the social network analysis to be one of, if not the largest predictor of sustained happiness, because you have this friendship, right? That's not a material good. It's not a tangible thing that you can just trade and sell. It's something that you put work into and they put work into to sustain over time. And if if you're entering retirement, you probably did different activities with your friends. You might have transitioned from tennis to pickleball. You never know. I know we got pickleballers. What's really unique about it is that piece alone is one of those predictors. And so when we see kind of the rise of mental health issues, we know that a lot of that is due to isolation, and it's due to lack of social bonds. And so the lack of social bonds and meaning and relationships we have to others really increases that stress and those mental health issues. And so people react differently to stress. So some people, when they're stressed, they seek out people and they want to, vent or tell them about it and do that. Other people tend to isolate for a variety of reasons. One, they don't want to put stress onto other people. The other piece is that, they feel vulnerable. And when you're vulnerable, you tend to want to go inward. The issue, well, there's issues with both. But the issue with the isolation technique is that you're no longer sharing your stress with someone else. And there's a lot of good in venting to other people. I'm going to say that. Let them know you want to vent, right? Don't just say, Loney told me to just tell you everything that I got on my mind. But if you have good friends that are willing to listen, it feels really good. It's a huge stress relief, and it also builds connections with others because now you're building trust with other people. You opened up to other people, and now you feel like you can trust them. And so that's another piece of using the social network theory. Family. Family is a huge one. I was talking to, I don't remember who it was. I was talking to someone after I did a presentation on the rise of school shootings and the profile of school shooters. And they're like, what about family? And family is a huge one. And in most cases of delinquency, you can tie criminal activity to family bonds. And so researchers followed hundreds of families for a decade and found that the quality of family bonds mattered more to overall happiness than income. And we know that. And so what's really interesting is, as we're doing new studies on family, it's not necessarily the family structure as much as just the family bonds. And so there's a lot of studies that show nuclear family tends to be the strongest with bonds and normalized in society. But if there are strong family bonds, even with divorced parents, that will also lead to this sustained happiness as well. And so from the family side, we see, right, our own happiness is tied to the relations to others, which brings us to other types of relationships. And for that, we already talked about, having your best friend or two. This is more focused on kind of an intimate relationship with a partner. And so what's key about that is the ability to be intimate with another person was one of the strongest predictors of health and happiness. Intimacy phobic and commitment phobic individuals were among the most unhappy and discontented individuals. We'll pause, but what that really means is similar to that vulnerability piece, and psychologists and sociologists have found the same, that if you have the ability to be vulnerable with other people, it strengthens the social bonds, and it also makes you feel like you are a part of something bigger than yourself. And that is a huge thing that can decrease mental health issues. When you have a connection to a community, friends, intimate partner, family, then you have this, it's not just you alone, and it basically reduces those amounts of isolation and withdrawal from society. The problem with isolation is that when you withdraw from society and you don't have shared bonds or goals with society, you no longer feel like you fit into society. And that's really then what happens when people start to seek out bonds elsewhere, or other mental health issues can arise as well. The environment, we know this place. Another interesting piece is that our happiness really relates to the natural world. And we don't have all the science with it. I know that there's major studies going on in Japan about forest bathing, about the idea of what is actually not just walking through the forest and looking at it, but really being in it. And if you're somebody that's interested in kind of the senses, being in here and looking out does actually bring out happiness, but being able to smell, see, touch, maybe even be bitten by a mosquito or two can increase or decrease, I guess, our relationship with the environment. And the natural world is pretty interesting because if you go on hikes, environmental sociologists call parks, we call it second nature because we've still changed it. So it's not necessarily the natural world because we've created paths, but it still brings out the same type of emotions, feelings, happiness and joy as well, and bond. And so there's consistent personality, attitudinal, behavioral, and well-being differences for those who strongly identify and feel connected to the natural world compared to those who don't. Individuals higher in nature connectedness tend to be more conscientious, extroverted, agreeable, and open. And this leads to a really important question socially. What social factors could limit one's connection with nature? Okay, perfect. So lack of access, and that can be wide ranging, right? It could be people with disabilities, it could be money, it could be location of where you're at. If you don't have access to natural world parks, whatever it might be, that would limit your connectedness with the natural world. Yeah. Yes, right. And so there is kind of the image of who goes out into, and that can stop people from going out into the natural world. One of the biggest predictors of that is if you go outside as a youth. And one weird benefit of COVID is that a lot more people went into the boundary waters over the last few years with kids than they otherwise would have. And so it might have kind of re-sparked the idea of taking your kids camping and other pieces of that. What other social factors could limit it? Yeah.
Being just addicted to video games or bowling would keep the guy from getting out the woods.
Yes. And so we can relate that to a couple things, right? What other social activities you might have? Also the increase in use of technology. It's insane. It's getting worse, actually, the amount of screen time that young people have. And we're actually getting to the point where people are born into it without having it beforehand. And so I remember sitting at my parents' computer and it was buffering and you couldn't get on, someone was on the phone, and I'm like, right, and I just can't use it right now, which is kind of a positive thing. I guess I just can't use the computer right now. But now when we have access, people really young are getting cell phones now, that becomes normalized every day. Are there other factors that we can think of? In the back.
Mobility.
Definitely, yes. And I'm lucky enough, Mark Carlson, who works at the college, has an amazing program in outdoor leadership and rec therapy, where he gets students involved and they work with people with mobility issues, disabilities, to get them out doing those activities. And so pretty fortunate to have such a unique program that goes at that challenge directly and tries to challenge it. And it's amazing some of the new products that they've made that can help people with mobility issues in those certain situations. Yes.
Income.
Oh, yes, yeah, money, and oftentimes time, right? I'll associate it and time and money, and bowling, right? But time is tough, money is tough, and so the more options we have that are open and free, are fantastic. And then you had one as well, I'm sorry. Yes. Absolutely. So the other piece of it, like anything, if you're not socialized at a young age, that makes it really hard for you to associate different things with even trying that. And so one thing I love about Vermilion is when we get new students, we tend to, you're going in a canoe or you're going in the woods right away, whether you've done it before. And so then they get this taste of it right away. But role models is big. If your role models aren't doing that. And we're getting at the time now where, if parents are on their cell phones all the time, kids model that behavior as well. And so instead of that, if you're out in the woods, that's what those children are going to then model. So what we've covered is the idea of these macro policies, right? If there's macroeconomic issues, right? If we're in a depression and people don't have jobs, they're probably not thinking about, I need to go on a hike, right? They're looking at other things. If there's a pandemic that impacts, right? It totally changed the moral guidance of behavior. What can we do? Who can we communicate with? And so sometimes there's the social forces above just our family and friends that are guiding it, right? And if the American dream is getting farther and farther out of reach, those things can impact mental health. And so when we're listening to the news, and that's the hot button topic still, is mental health. If we're thinking like a sociologist, we want to go, well, what are the roots that are actually impacting that are maybe stopping people from really living that happy life? And sometimes it's just those kind of cultural norms. Other times it can be family relationship, like we talked about, social networking, your close friends, and then, ties to the environment or your intimate relationships as well. So I have an activity because I'm a teacher. I have an assistant. Multiple assistants.
Yep. Yeah. Thank you.
There you go. I'll get back in the room.
Let's see, sharp pencils, my goodness.
So one thing we didn't really dive into really is kind of the cultural piece. You might have cultural influences that spark different behaviors, different attitudes, different activities you do. And so for this, what we're going to do is you're going to write down specific things that bring you joy in your life. It's like positive journaling. This is great. And what I want you to do, I don't want you to just write down like family or my amazing fiance, right? Don't do those things. What you want to write down is, if it's family, you'd want to write down reading with my grandchildren. A very specific thing that sparks joy, not just the thought, but what's the action that sparks that joy. So instead of writing down vacations, you could write down, what about the vacation brings you joy? There's something, Is there a place you go? Is it something you look forward to? Is it trying new food? Is it meeting new people? Is it learning the history of the areas you go to, which is always, I think, the best part? At the bottom of the page, I want you to write down a few things that you take for granted. And so I want you to kind of think about that after you write down the things that bring you joy. I'll give you plenty of time for this too. Are we willing to embrace a little bit of chaos? Good, perfect. I'm going to give you a number, 1 through 10. This is going to be your brand new social group for 1, 2, 5, 7, 8, 9, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so if you were the first 10, group of 10, you are the captain of this new ship. And so we'll just kind of make spaces. 1s will be here, 2s will be here, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And you are going to share what you're willing to share that brings you joy and that you take for granted. And make sure to introduce each other. Oh, I get a picture. Is she gone already?
Yeah.
Yep. Hey. Gotta get me. If I counted correctly, most groups will have 4 people. And a couple groups will have 2 or 5, sorry. I think we're getting there. So you can find a table, you can stand and talk, get to know each other, find a spot. I'll interrupt you for just a second here. For just 1 second. There's no final conclusion, but I hope that meeting new people, you were able to spread joy and happiness. And so there's no final conclusion, but I hope you met some new people and continue your conversations because this is lovely. Love it. Thank you.